right, everybody, how's everything going? Hope everyone's doing pretty well. Hopefully everyone's staying safe, not having any issues with the quarantine. G, hello, do you want to say hi? Hopefully everything's going well for everybody. A couple things here, just moving forward here. This is for African American Studies. Every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and possibly Thursday, as long as we're going to be having notes, you will have your vocabulary be accessible at 7 a.m. along with the lecture video at 7 a.m. and the success criteria that you have to do at the end at 7 a.m. That gives you roughly between 7 and 5 p.m. to get it done, a 10-hour span to go through and get your work done for the day. Again, it's nothing crazy. It shouldn't take anything more than 30 minutes. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Again, this is our first day of online learning, so make sure that you're paying attention. Make sure that if you have any questions, issues, or concerns, make sure you're getting a hold of me during my office hours between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And yeah. And if you need anything else, possibly like a conference or anything, we can set up a Zoom conference call and we can kind of work through things and see what you're having issues with. But other than that, it shouldn't be anything too crazy. Again, this week you're going to have 3 days of notes. That'll be on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then Thursday and Friday. Wait a minute, is it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? Yep. Okay, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you'll be having notes. And then Thursday, Friday, you are going to be expected to work on the Admentum assignment that is assigned at the beginning of the week on Monday at 7 a.m. You have until Friday at 5 p.m. to get it done. Again, you can work on it whenever you want throughout the week. You can get it all done in one day. You can take your time and work work on it throughout the entire week, or you can just take the entire day on Thursday and Friday to work on it. Again, it shouldn't be anything too crazy. It's just some slides, some videos. You go through and you answer the questions throughout, and then you take the test at the end. Again, the test is not necessarily for a grade. This is for participation. So showing that you actually went on there and actually did it and participated and did what you're supposed to. Here's the thing. I can see how long you've been on it. So if you've been on it for like a minute and everything's done and you get a 0, I'm not going to give you credit for it. It's pretty simple. Now, if you go through and you show some effort and you take your time and you get it done, and I can tell that you took your time and worked on it, no problem giving you the points. Again, don't be dumb. Don't make dumb decisions. Again, this is just like we're in school. Your actions have repercussions. If you want to be lazy and not do your work the way it's supposed to be done, that's what's going to happen. Anyway, getting into today, we're beginning our new unit for new unit 11, standing up for your rights. Again, there is 6 sections to this. So the way it's going to work is this week we're going to have 3 sections. Next week is spring break. Then when we get back, there will be the other 3 sections. So as I'm posting this, you're only going to be seeing the first 3 sections notes, and you'll see the rest later on. Again, if you have issues with that, feel free to come to me and we can kind of try to work things out. But 3 days of work and then the Admentum assignment. So make sure you're staying on the ball, make sure you're getting it done. Again, if it's past 5 p.m. when you turn it in, it is considered late and it will be docked points. Don't be dumb, get your work done, and then, have a great rest of your day. So getting started, again, we're on unit 11. So our first section here, our chapter is chapter 35. We're talking about African Americans in World War I. Again, before we left, we had actually watched a short video on the Hellfighters with World War I. So a lot of that's actually going to be focused on here with the Hellfighters. If you noticed that from your vocabulary before you start watching this video. So again, we're going to talk a lot about how the African Americans were used in the war, and more so how they weren't used in the war. Okay, so again, if you have questions, issues, concerns after this is all done, make sure you reach out to me. Success criteria for today. Number 1, explain African Americans' reasoning for fighting World War I and identify how many actually fought. 2, identify the Hellfighters and their impact on World War I. 3, explain how African American soldiers were being used during the war. 4, explain the incident that occurred in Houston, Texas between African American soldiers and local whites. And then finally 5, compare how Americans and the French treated African American soldiers. So again, here what you're going to be seeing is how Americans treated African American soldiers, and then actually how the French treated African American soldiers, which is kind of interesting to see, and to kind of see how 2 different regions of the world were treating Africans at this time. So getting into today's first slide here, African Americans in the World War. So African Americans again volunteered to fight abroad for democracy. hoping for an end to racism and discrimination at home. Again, we saw this earlier on when we talked about the French and Indian War. We had African Americans going out and fighting. We talked about the Buffalo Soldiers. They were fighting for democracy. They were fighting for their rights. They thought, hey, you know what? If we show that we're willing to defend our country and fight for democracy, that hopefully the country will actually show us democracy and show us respect and give us rights. However, that wasn't the case. Again, we see this throughout history, not necessarily just the presidents, but the government and the actual military still had a lot of laws and a lot of issues when it came to concerning African Americans and their rights and segregation. So President Wilson believed in segregation of the races during this time period as World War I is kicking off. Wilson said we should fight the Germans to make the world safe for democracy, but didn't believe in democracy in African Americans. So if you're looking at Woodrow Wilson right now, the first thing that probably comes to mind is a hypocrite. You're saying, hey, we want to fight for democracy. We want to fight for these people's rights abroad. We're trying to fight, for the Jewish people, but instead we're still restricting African Americans at home. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Despite that, nearly 370,000 African Americans joined the war efforts and were met with discrimination in the military. So nearly 500,000 soldiers that were African Americans fought in this war. Necessarily they were in the war, but they weren't necessarily always fighting, which you're going to see in a couple slides. Next thing here, African Americans in the World War continued. Racism occurred to African American soldiers regularly. One incident broke out at a hotel and caused the entire 15th Regiment to be relocated from South Carolina to France over a newspaper. So an African American soldier went into a hotel, wanted to buy a newspaper, and the person working the desk of the hotel refused to sell the newspaper until the African American would take off his cap, and he refused to. And then they kicked him out of the hotel, and then he went back and told his buddies, hey, I just got kicked out of this hotel. I was just trying to buy a newspaper, and he wouldn't sell it to me because I wouldn't take my cap off. And then it came back, and then a whole brawl broke loose over this. So when this 15th Regiment was relocated, it was relocated to France, became known as the 369th Regiment, which eventually became the what we know today as the Hellfighters, because they were the most courageous and fierce soldiers that we saw, not necessarily with just African Americans, but across all American soldiers. They fought a notorious battle that lasted 191 days. So we're talking over half of a calendar year. So we're talking 6 months. So longer than what this quarantine is probably going to end up being. And never gave up 1 inch of a nearly 3-mile stretch of land. 3 miles. If you don't know what 3 miles is, go outside and run around and tell me how tired you are after running 3 miles. 3 miles of land, which was nearly 20% of the American-controlled land in Germany. So we controlled about 15 miles worth of land 15 miles worth of land in Germany, the Americans did, and they held down 3 miles of it against German soldiers for over half of a calendar year. It's just absolutely insane. It goes into showing just how courageous and just how fierce they were. And I mean, a lot of times, you talk about, think about what you're fighting for, think about what's going on. Obviously they're fighting for their lives, but they're also fighting for people back home. Not only the people that live in our country, but the people who are being oppressed and people who are dealing with discrimination. So you're seeing that issue kind of arise there, and you're seeing them be able to go out and fight for what they believe in. 2 men actually received the Croix de Guerre, I hope I pronounced that right, which is the French equivalent of the Purple Heart. If you've ever heard of the Purple Heart, it's given out to soldiers who basically risk life and limb for their country, and oftentimes, don't come back completely whole. And in this case, 2 of the men from the Hellfighters actually received this, which is the highest military honor in France. So that just goes to show you just how hardworking they were, despite not getting any recognition from the American government. Next thing here, African Americans in the World War. Despite the success and accredited efforts of the Hellfighters with the French, Americans did not use African Americans as heavily as the French did. So for example, when the French were given African American soldiers, they said, okay, well, you're soldiers, you're going to go fight. Whereas Americans were a little less likely to use the actual African Americans in these fights. So African Americans in the American armies were mainly used for labor. So again, we're going back to the idea of using African Americans for labor, which seems very hypocritical and belittling not only to these people, but to the African American community. So you're belittling these African Americans as white soldiers held a higher status in the military, because they could go and say, well, we're fighting for our country and you're just working for us. You're just doing the labor. Again, the whole idea that whites were trying to keep themselves above African Americans at this point in time. Many African Americans were kicked, cuffed, and dealt harmful blows throughout this. Again, because like if they said anything, then all of a sudden the people who are above them in the military were coming after them. All right, and on to the next slide here. So next thing here, again, kind of the theme of this whole talk here is racism. Moving forward here. So in 1917, African American soldiers that were training in Houston, Texas, obviously getting ready for the war at this point in time, they were stationed in Houston, Texas, and a group of them refused to leave a streetcar. So the thing was, these streetcars were how people got around throughout Houston, and these people were saying, Americans were saying, well, we're going on the streetcar, we're about to defend for our country, we need to go somewhere. And the local whites were saying, no, you're not allowed on here because we still have segregation involved, and you're not allowed on this streetcar. And the African Americans refused to get off. They said, we're defending our country, we're fighting for our country, we are not getting off of this. So that group of whites pulled them off the car and verbally abused them. The African Americans went back to their barracks, informed the other African Americans of what was going on, and those African Americans came back with guns, and what ended up becoming a huge riot in 1917 ended up leaving 12 whites dead. The whites were considered innocent in this situation, and 13 African Americans were hanged and 14 were in prison for life. So we're talking in this whole ordeal, almost 40 people ended up dead over a streetcar. Again, at this point in time, the whole premises wasn't necessarily thinking about it in hindsight. Hindsight's 2020. We can say fighting over a streetcar is not worth it, right? Especially if 40 people are going to die. It's not worth it. But at this point in time, this is the way segregation was. We believed you need to stay over here, this group needs to stay over here, and this group needs to stay over here. And that's not right. But that's the way the thinking was then. It's just like thinking about basketball these days, right? Back in the day, there was no three-point shot. People didn't shoot three-pointers. Now that's all everyone shoots. The game changes. Things change. And, if you were to go back and look at the game and put yourself into those shoes during that time playing the game, it wouldn't make any sense to you not to shoot it. It's because hindsight's 2020. Also, finally here, the last thing, recognition abroad. Americans frequently treat African Americans as second-class citizens with racism and discrimination. We know this. We've been talking about this for the past couple months with this class. American military leaders also frequently sent secret orders to the French in hopes of persuading them to treat them as such. So basically, the American military were sending messages to the French military saying, hey, there's this ordinance we want to be enacted, not letting the African Americans fight or not letting them hang out with all the other people because they are second-class citizens. They're dangerous. They're horrible people, is what they were saying. However, the French people were more than pleased with the African Americans and their efforts, and with their conduct and the way that they held themselves. And they frequently went out together. They allowed them into their homes. They went to nightclubs, they went to cafes, they went to restaurants, they went to hotels. They were treated with respect. They were treated as an actual human being. And so imagine being one of these Hellfighters who fought abroad for the French for all these years, and then come back to America and go back to the way it was with segregation, and seeing that their efforts in this war meant nothing to Americans. Nothing. But the French recognized them. French said, you know what, hey, we're going to honor you with the highest, everything you can think of, the highest military rank, well, not necessarily the highest military rank, but the highest military honors, all that type of stuff. They were honored by the French military because of their effort and their bravery. But yet when they came back, Americans didn't recognize them, didn't show them the respect that they deserved that the French did. Which is disheartening because when you think about it, these African Americans are our citizens, not the French citizens, and the French are treating them better than what we are. Let that sink in for a little bit. And again, that's all we got for today. Hopefully that was a little bit of a kicker there for you to kind of think about. Again, if you guys are interested in World War I, I know this is pretty quick. Again, I'm trying to get out some short, quick videos that way you guys can get your work done with these times going on. However, if you want to, again, look up World War I, African Americans, literally just search it straight on YouTube. You'll find a bunch of really cool videos about African Americans and their effect on World War I and how they kind of went about things. So, that being said, number one, make sure your vocab's done. Number two, make sure you went through and watched the lecture video or at least looked at the notes. I'm sure if you didn't watch the lecture video, then you're not hearing this. And then number three, make sure you get your success criteria done. Success criteria needs to be done every day. It needs to be done by 5 p.m. And also make sure you're working on your Edmentum assignment throughout. Again, if you're having issues accessing the Edmentum assignment, you need to reach out to me so we can make sure we get you set up and make sure everything's good. Yeah, so keep washing your hands, stay safe, go on a couple walks when it's dry out, and have a great rest of your day. See you guys tomorrow.